Imagine being invited to a grand royal dinner. The chandeliers are glowing. The hall is echoing with soft violin music. Goblets of wine are poured. Silver platters are uncovered with grace, but as you settle into your seat, your eyes catch something that makes your heart freeze. Sitting at the head of the table is a corpse, dressed in regal garments, unmoving, silent, but unmistakably dead, yet treated like royalty. Everyone acts like it's normal, no one flinches, and you realize you're not just a guest, you're part of a ritual that's been going on for centuries. This is not a horror story. This is real history. Welcome to the chilling tale of a royal family whose obsession with power, legacy, and grief turned grotesque. A family that dined with the dead, preserved their ancestors in lifelike poses, and forced generations to attend dinner alongside corpses dressed in jewels and silks. Their castle became a museum of the macabre, and their legend, whispered behind palace doors, became one of the darkest chapters in royal history. If you enjoy dark tales from real history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning. And trust me, it gets much worse. Now let's go back to where this twisted legacy began. The story starts in the mid-18th century, in the heart of Eastern Europe, a region marked by Gothic castles, deep superstitions, and fiercely private monarchies. Here ruled the House of Velkovich, a small but powerful dynasty that governed a secluded principality tucked between the Carpathian Mountains and endless pine forests. They were not a famous royal family, not like the Habsburgs or the Romanovs, but they were respected, feared, and above all, secretive. At the center of this story is King Dragomir Velkovich, a ruler known for his obsessive love for two things: his bloodline and death. From the outside, Dragomir was a typical monarch, educated, cold, intelligent. But behind the high stone walls of his estate, something else was happening. According to personal letters recovered after the fall of the dynasty, Dragomir had an early fascination with embalming and human preservation. Some say it began when his twin brother died of plague as a child, and Dragomir refused to let the body be buried. He was only 10. For 3 weeks, he kept his brother's corpse in bed beside him, combing his hair, dressing him, talking to him. The staff whispered. The queen wept, but no one dared oppose him. That incident was just the beginning. Years later, when Dragomir became king, he surrounded himself with scholars of death. He hosted secret meetings with embalmers from Egypt. He ordered books banned by the Vatican. And most chillingly, he had the royal crypt beneath his palace redesigned into what he called the Eternal Hall, a place where no royal was ever to be buried underground again. Instead, they would be preserved, put on display at the dinner table. Yes, you heard that right. The first to be placed in the Eternal Hall was Queen Mother Valina. She died in her sleep at the age of 62 after years of illness. But Dragomir refused a funeral. Within hours, he called in his personal alchemist and had her embalmed with a mixture of mercury, resin, and crushed pearls. Her body was adorned with sapphires and crimson robes. Then she was placed in a high-backed golden chair and wheeled into the royal dining room. That evening, the court dined as usual. Except now, Queen Valina sat at the table, lifeless. A servant stood behind her to keep her head upright. Plates were set in front of her, and the music never stopped. This was not a one-time occurrence. It became tradition. Every time a royal died, they were cleaned, painted, perfumed, and seated at the banquet permanently. The staff was instructed to clean the corpses weekly, change their clothing, and even touch up their makeup. By the time Dragomir was 50, the dining hall had 15 corpses seated at various points, all dressed in ceremonial attire, all positioned. With eerie grace, the king insisted on greeting them each night before sitting down. "Good evening, grandfather. You look radiant tonight," he would say to a dried-out husk of a man who died decades earlier. Foreign guests were often horrified. One German envoy wrote, "It is like dining in a mausoleum. The dead stare through their empty sockets. And yet none of the living seemed disturbed. They toast them as if they live." But to Dragomir, this was legacy. This was family, he believed. That death did not sever royal duty, that once a king or queen passed on, they still had a role to play, to witness, to oversee, to silently guide the living. This belief extended even to celebrations. On the king's birthday, the dead were dressed in new garments. On the anniversary of the queen mother's death, she was given a new crown. And during state negotiations, if an ancestor had once fought in the war being discussed, their corpse was wheeled into the hall as a reminder of the family's blood price. But perhaps the darkest moment came in the winter of 1764, when the king's own daughter, Princess Marija, fell ill with fever. She was only 17. Despite every effort, she passed away in her sleep, just like her grandmother. Dragomir was devastated, but what he did next chilled even the most loyal. Of his advisors, he not only had her embalmed, he had her posed as if asleep, curled gently with a book in her lap, forever frozen on a chaise near the fireplace in the royal lounge. Then, in the evenings, he would sit beside her, read aloud from her favorite stories, and whisper lullabies. Sometimes, the servant said, he wept. Other times, he smiled as if nothing was wrong, and that was only the beginning of his descent. What started as obsession soon became madness. The castle began to smell of rot masked by rose oil. Servants were forbidden to speak ill of the dead. Any who refused to serve food to the corpses were dismissed. And soon, even the living members of the royal court began to falter. Some whispered that the spirits of the dead were angry, that they did not want to be propped up like puppets, that their souls had turned on the family. Then the accidents began. One noble fell down the stairs, another choked during dinner. The royal falconer was found hanged in the courtyard. Dragomir claimed it was all coincidence, but the court began to fear the dead more than the living, and in the shadows of the castle halls, something darker stirred. By the time dusk fell upon the somber halls of the palace, the atmosphere had grown heavier with each passing hour. Visitors who once came intrigued by the royal family's charm and vast lineage now left with unsettled glances and trembling hands. Whispers had turned into rumors, and rumors had taken on a life of their own. The servants, who once held their positions with honor, now spoke in hushed tones in the back corridors, of shadows that whispered, and portraits whose painted eyes followed them as they passed. Something inside that palace had changed, and it wasn't just the grief lingering in the wake of a family tragedy. It was something darker, something alive. Many years before the royal obsession with death became public knowledge, the seeds had already been planted in the form of rituals. At first, they seemed like common noble customs. A candlelight vigil here, a private morning feast there. But soon, the scale of their death-centric practices began to shift. It started with an ornate room, draped in deep velvet and gold, where portraits of deceased family members lined the walls. A room strictly forbidden to guests. It was said that at midnight, a thick incense was burned and the family would enter that room barefoot, dressed in ceremonial black, and sit in silence for hours. It might have seemed like nothing more than grief to outsiders, but the palace guards knew better. They heard the chants. One guard, an aging man who had served the palace since his youth, recalled an incident when he stumbled upon something horrifying. He had been called into the dining chamber late one evening after hearing a loud crash. Assuming it was a servant who'd broken a dish or two, he entered without knocking. What he saw instead froze him in place. The entire royal family was seated at the dinner table, dressed in ceremonial garb. In the seat at the head of the table was the decaying body of the Queen Mother. Her skin was sunken, her lips dark, her hands placed stiffly on the table. Yet no one flinched. They were eating as if nothing was wrong. He was silenced swiftly, sent away under the guise of a mental breakdown, and replaced by another loyal to the crown. But stories like his persisted. Over the years, anyone who worked closely with the royals seemed to either vanish or fall into mysterious madness. A chef who accidentally entered the wrong chamber was never seen again. A young maid who reportedly fainted upon seeing a figure sitting upright in a closed casket was sent to an asylum. One of the palace's scribes, in a drunken stupor, had written in his journal about a dark dinner held with the dead under candlelight, while a string quartet played music composed by the deceased king himself. But it wasn't just insiders who began to notice something off. Noble families from neighboring regions who came for diplomatic banquets began to avoid the palace altogether. One foreign prince, known for his firm rationalism and disbelief in superstition, was said to have fled mid-dinner, claiming he'd seen the duchess who had reportedly passed 3 months earlier glance at him from the hallway mirror. When asked about it, the palace denied all allegations, calling it a hallucination caused by stress and wine. But the word had spread. Behind the castle walls, things had only grown stranger. The family had begun commissioning wax sculptors, embalmers, and taxidermists not for animals, but for heritage preservation, as they claimed. Deep within the palace archives was a hidden room. Few ever saw it, but one of the workers who maintained the grounds swore to have caught a glimpse inside. When the door was left ajar, he described seeing what looked like seated human figures, preserved bodies arranged as though frozen in time. He recognized their garments from old paintings hanging in the public halls. These weren't mannequins, these were the ancestors. And they weren't buried in crypts, they were displayed. The royal family justified these strange practices under the guise of ancestral worship. "We honor our blood," the king once said during an interview in Life and Beyond. It was presented as tradition, misinterpreted by outsiders who didn't understand their deep heritage, but beneath that surface, the family was becoming increasingly reclusive. They dined only at night, windows were shrouded in heavy drapes, fresh flowers were replaced by dried wreaths. The palace grew colder, as if even sunlight refused to stay, and then came the child. The young prince, barely 12, was said to have been the brightest of them all, with a smile that lit up even the coldest rooms. But after the death of his sister, something inside him shifted. He was found one morning seated in the ancestral chamber, whispering to the embalmed remains of his grandmother. "She speaks to me," he said to the attending nurse. "She tells me secrets the living don't know." Instead of concern, the king praised his son. "He is connected to the line," he declared. "The blood speaks through him." From that moment on, the boy was no longer seen during the day. Tutors came and went, never to return. His room became the most heavily guarded in the palace. Rumors began circulating that the boy had been possessed, or worse, that he was being groomed to carry on the dark tradition in ways even more sinister than his predecessors. Some years later, a rare visitor was allowed into the palace, an aged historian known for his discretion and fascination with royal bloodlines. He was invited under the promise of writing an official family chronicle. What he found, he never published, but in a letter to a colleague, he described the final dinner he had attended there. There were 12 seats, he wrote. 6 were occupied by the living, 6 by the preserved dead, and they ate as one family in silence under the watchful gaze of 1,000 candle flames and a portrait that bled from the eyes. He fled that night and never returned. Now, the royal lineage remains intact, but deeply hidden. Very little is known about the current generation. The palace still stands, shadowed by centuries of secrets, and no longer open to visitors. Some say the family still dines with the dead, that the rituals continue, and the past is never buried, only seated, again and again, at the same cursed table. But the real question is, was this just madness fueled by grief, or had the royal bloodline discovered something, some connection to the beyond, that they were desperately trying to keep alive? The stench of decay did not bother them anymore. For the royal family of Ellsworth, the line between life and death had been blurred for far too long. They still gathered around the dining hall table every evening, the grand chandelier casting soft glows over lifeless eyes. The bodies of their deceased kin remained seated in their original spots, untouched and unburied, dressed in silks and jewels, their faces frozen in the expressions they died with. What began as grief had now festered into obsession. One evening, a servant named Mar Young, observant and full of unease, dared to voice a question that had haunted the rest of the staff for years. Why do they keep the dead at the table? Her whisper, intended for no ears but her own, was overheard by Lord Edgar himself. He did not scold her. he did not shout. Instead, he placed a calm, cold hand on her shoulder and said, because they still listen, Mara fled the castle that night and was never seen again, but the legend did not flee with her. It grew. Villagers claimed that the spirits of the dead began wandering the castle grounds at night. Some said they saw the Queen Mother's pale hand brush across the cold window panes, staring out into the dark. Others swore they heard music the same waltz played at the royal ball decades ago echoing from the now abandoned grand ballroom. Even hunters who strayed too close to the forest's edge spoke of shadowy figures moving behind the trees, their silhouettes gaunt, their clothes tattered but regal. Every tale made the walls around Castle Ellsworth feel thicker, colder, more sentient. Years passed, and the castle remained sealed, guarded by superstition and silence. Those who dared enter found things untouched, as if time itself refused to move forward within those stone walls. Cobwebs clung to teacups still half full, books remained open mid-read. And always, the dining hall was just as it had been, a banquet of the dead, presided over by a throne that now sat empty. It was only decades later, during the reign of a curious and skeptical prince from a neighboring kingdom, that the sealed gates were reopened. The prince, armed with torches, servants, and a deep desire to uncover truth, entered Castle Ellsworth with the confidence of a man who had never believed in ghosts. But when he stepped into the dining hall, even he who had faced wars, assassins, and political betrayal was silenced. The bodies were still there. Not skeletons, not mummified husks, but strangely preserved corpses, sitting exactly as they had been. Some even had faint smiles on their faces. The food on the table had long rotted, but not them. And beside each corpse was a nameplate, etched in gold, with their title and cause of death. The prince ordered one body examined by his physicians. They found something bizarre in the vein traces of a chemical compound no one could identify. It wasn't formaldehyde, it wasn't salt or any known embalming agent. It was something else, something lost to history. From the journals found in the royal chambers, the truth emerged. It turned out that generations of the Ellsworth family had been obsessed with a lost alchemical text, one rumored to contain secrets to preserve the soul beyond death. Not to bring someone back, but to keep them present, a consciousness tethered to the physical form, awake, aware, and still part of the living world forever. The patriarch of the family, the first one to try it, believed that grief was merely an illusion and that love could bind the soul to the body indefinitely, but the side effects were horrifying. The preserved dead began showing signs of sentience, flinches, whispers, faint movements. At first, they were considered miracles, then they became unbearable. Some family members tried to reverse the process and failed. Some took their own lives, others pretended everything was fine. Eventually, madness consumed them all, and what remained was a hollow ritual, a twisted dinner with the dead repeated every night by those too afraid to let go. No one knows what became of the final heir of Ellsworth. Some say he still sits at the head of the table, alive, but rotted from within. Others believe he vanished into the walls, or maybe into the forest, where the dead whisper under the trees. The castle remains closed again, visitors are rare, and those who do return speak little of what they saw. But if you walk close enough on a moonless night, you might hear the clinking of silverware, the scrape of a chair, or the soft, breathless giggle of someone who hasn't breathed in a century. This is the legacy of Ellsworth, the royal family who dined with the dead, spoke to them, and loved them long after the grave claimed them. Not out of denial, not even out of devotion, but out of fear. Fear that if they let go, they too would be forgotten. And so they remained, one by one, until none were left alive, only memory, ritual, and the echoes of a dinner that never truly ended. And now that you've heard their story, ask yourself how far would you go to keep someone close, even in death? If you found this story as hauntingly fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we've got more forgotten horrors and eerie truths waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious and stay careful. You never know which royal halls still echo with the voices of the dead.